Welcome to the Fedora Core 22 install tutorial. I'm going to be upgrading a few of our machines to Fedora Core 22. I'll actually be reinstalling the machines and then migrating the data back. Some of them are quite old, Fedora Core 8 and up. And I thought it would be a great idea to document the process. I wanted to start by doing a basic Fedora Core 22 install and then moving from there. So in order to record this install, I'm going to be using my Mac OS X 10 desktop, and I'm going to install this into a virtual machine. Now, for all intended purposes, the process is the same. What is basically different is I'm doing it in a software versus actually on the hardware. But as far as the install process goes, it's all pretty much the same. So what I'm going to do here is first go ahead and add a new virtual machine. And it's going to ask me, am I migrating or installing? I'm obviously installing from scratch. Click continue. It's asking me where the disk for that install is. In this case, I'm using the Fedora Core server net install x86 64-bit for Fedora Core 22. This is going to be a server install, so no graphical user interface, and it's a net install, which means that this image only contains the information it needs to get the installer running. Once the installer is running, it's going to reach out into the World Wide Web, and it's going to pull the rest of the images it needs from the internet. So I click on open. It now lists that disk as the disk I've chosen. Click continue. I am doing a Linux Fedora Core 64-bit install, and I'm going to click continue from there. And so we are setting up a virtual machine, which is basically a piece of virtual machines. The way they work is they simulate a piece of hardware in software. In this case, we're simulating a 20 gigabyte hard drive, 1 gigabyte of memory with a shared NAT interface. So basically it's going to use the interface on the computer and it's going to do a network address translation to get out to the internet. And we could customize these settings, but for the purposes of this video it's really irrelevant. So we click on finish. It's going to save it as Fedora Core 64-bit 2 because I already have one installed here. You could give this whatever name you want, and the extension it's giving it is VMware VM. Basically the virtual machine, it's creating a file, in this case really a subdirectory with a bunch of files in it that are going to be the core of the operating system. So it's going to simulate a disk in that directory. So we launch it, and from here once we get to this screen, everything you see here would pretty much be the same as if you were installing it. So imagine you've put the CD into your hardware, you've started it up, you've told your hardware to boot from the CD, and this is where you would come to after you run through BIOS or EFI or whatever other load mechanism you have. There's a couple of options here. Obviously troubleshooting, that is if something goes wrong and you need to get in and test some stuff. The test this media and install Fedora Core 22, that is probably the recommended step. In fact, it's the default step when this first starts up. You want to make sure that you test that media before you do the install, so that in case there's corruption, which when loading from CD has happened to me before when I didn't follow this step, and that corruption can lead to all kinds of problems either during the install or post-install if things don't go in there quite right. So you want to make sure to test this media and install Fedora 22. In this case, since I've already used this media before and it's also just an image on my disk, I know that it works, so I'm going to select install Fedora 22. I hit enter, and now it's going to, the installer is going to run through the process of actually starting a Linux kernel and then loading all the modules it needs to be able to run Anaconda, which is the default installer for Fedora Core 22 Linux. So as you can see, it's running through some of its modules. Everything that has an OK next to it is good. Anything at this point, if anything fails, you're going to want to stop and figure out why it's failing. And it looks like everything went well, so it's starting the installer. At the bottom you can see it says Anaconda. You have some options that you could run through. In this case, we're just going to let it run through and do what it needs to do. This is actually a pretty straightforward install. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's kind of a no-brainer as far as installers go. It used to be for Linux the installer were kind of crazy, but in pretty much every distro now the installers have gotten really good and pretty straightforward. So in this case we just pick our language. We're doing US, keyboard is US, language is US or English, and in this case we're using United States English as opposed to United Kingdom English or any other version of English. Click on continue, and this is probably taking a little bit longer than it would on normal hardware since I'm running it in a virtual machine with a bunch of other stuff running in the background. As you can see, a couple of these items have exclamation points next to them. These ones grayed out. It's just starting up the installation source not set up. Network is set up, keyboard time and language are set up. Really the one thing that you're going to have to do here to get this going is you're going to have to come down here to your system. You're going to select the drive partition that you want to install this on. Click done. Okay, the disk is done, and it does take a little bit for it to validate that install software, so sometimes it takes a little bit longer for it to do it. Just so we can take a look at the Ethernet card while it's getting going. In this case, the virtual machine assigned it this Ethernet card with a really funky name. It's on, as you can see, it's 1000 megabits per second. This is the private network segment that it's set up. 172.16.2.0 is the network segment, and we're getting assigned IP address 132, and this basically gets NATed through the interface. Okay, so let's check the install. It's all ready to go. We've got the disk drive, everything's set up, and you click on begin install. At this point, it's going to create the partition on SDA2. So SDA would be the disk drive, SDA1 would be the actual boot partition, and then SDA2 would be the data partition. Now the one cool thing about this install is as it's going through its process, there are things you can do. For example, you can set the root password. In this case, I'm going to just use something somewhat strong, but that I'll remember. It's irrelevant to what I'm doing because this is going to get blown away as a partition. Click done. And here's something that I'll recommend. Please do not install with the root user only and then go from there. Make sure you create some user. In this case, I'm going to create Sean. And I'm going to set some password for this user. I have advanced options here, i.e. I can manage the user's user ID and his group and add him to any other groups that I want. In this case, I don't really care. Require password for this user account. Make this user administrator. Here's where it gets really important. You do not want to keep logging into your Unix, Linux machine with the root user ID and password. I still see a lot of this happening. It used to be in the old days everybody logged in as root and nobody cared, but nowadays it's pretty much good administrative practices to create a user that you log into who is part of the wheel group, and we'll again, we'll get into all that later. But effectively, he's an administrator. So when you want to administer the machine, instead of logging in or switching user to root and constantly putting in the root password, by some chance you may do it when there's a keylogger on, or you're really exposing that password by people looking over your shoulder, all kinds of stuff. By creating a administrative user, you're allowing yourself, or you're giving yourself the permission to do things as root without actually having to log in as root. So the only password that gets exposed is your own. If there is, and if you think somebody looked over your shoulder, or if you think by some chance there was a keylogger installed on your machine, you can always quickly go to a more secure machine and change your password without compromising that root password. So good idea to always create a user. I know I didn't give a good explanation of all the reasons why you should not use root to log into the machine, or use root and the root password ever on a system that you're installing. I think there's rare cases that you would ever want to use the root password, but in that case, you want to have it and you want to know it. But everything you do should be done as this user, and all modern Unix/Linux operating systems give you the full set of features that allow you to do that, from using sudo to actually switching user to root and all that kind of stuff. So always this should be something that you do as a first step when installing. As you can see, it's going down now through the install, and what I'll do is I'll end this video here, and on the next video we'll pick it up once we are at the next step of install. Okay, so it basically ran through the install, it downloaded all the software, it installed it on the machine, and all that's really left for us to do is to click on this button that says reboot. We click on reboot, and voila, it reboots. Now with Fedora Core you always get this option of, in the more recent versions of Fedora, you get the option of moving into rescue mode. Basically it drops you into a terminal and gives you some other options to check to see what's going on and why things aren't working. In this case, the first option, and the automatic option that would have loaded had I not touched the keys, is Fedora 22. So I click on enter. It would have automatically done it once the timeout had crossed. I just wanted to show you this. And as you can see now, it is installing on my machine Fedora, or sorry, starting up on my machine Fedora release 22. It gives you the kernel and the type of kernel, in this case x86-64. Now remember, I don't want to log in as root. That's why I created the other user. I log in using the super secret password that I now no longer remember. Let's see if I got, there we go. So it logged me in as the local user. There's nothing really in my directory, and if there's anything I really need to do, I can start doing it on my machine. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go through and install this onto a real machine, and then we're going to use SSH to log into the machine.